Welcome back, everybody. Doug and Aleya, and this is the I'll Bring You Soup project, where we are describing the three basic skills that you need so that you can always tell somebody you love, I'll always bring you soup. And what we mean by I'll bring you soup is that no matter how upset somebody else is, you'll be able to be with them in a compassionate, caring, graceful way without being upset yourself, and be able to serve somebody else that you love with grace and love and intimacy. So the three skills are learning how to validate emotions, learning how to cherish something deep within yourself, and learning how to meet all of your own needs internally so that you're not looking for somebody else to fill your internal needs, because then you never fill your own needs. In this session, what?
So when we look for our needs from another person, no matter how much they're meeting our needs, it's never going to be enough. It's like this endless pit.
Right. So in this session, we want to talk about the first skill, the foundational skill. I call it the foundational skill of life, and that is learning how to validate emotions. The technical term is called affect labeling. I discovered this skill in 2005 in a very difficult mediation that I was called to mediate in, and I had no tools for de-escalating strong emotions. And the thought came to me as I watched this angry couple scream at each other, listen to the emotions, and I had them listen to each other's emotions rather than their words and reflect them. And magic happened. They calmed down almost immediately. And where if there had been knives on the table at the beginning of the mediation session, there would be blood on the floor. 4 hours later, they had resolved the lawsuit that they were involved with against each other and walked out of the conference room holding hands and having lunch, even though they'd been divorced for 19 years. It was really an amazing display of transformation that occurred because of what I was able to help them do. Well, I knew what I'd done, but I didn't understand it. I tested it out in other high conflict cases that I had, and I got the same results. And then in 2007, a brain scanning study came out of Matthew Lieberman's lab at UCLA showing what happens in the brain when you reflect emotions. It's called affect labeling. And essentially what the brain scanning studies show is that when your emotions are labeled, the emotional centers of the brain are inhibited, they quiet down. And at the same time, the part of the brain called the right ventrolateral prefrontal cortex is activated. That's the executive function, our thinking part of our brain gets activated. And the net result is that within 90 seconds, the most angry, emotional, upset person literally becomes calm. It happens unconsciously, and you cannot resist it because our brains are hardwired for this. I have taught these skills in places as different as maximum security prisons where I've trained life inmates serving life sentences without possibility of parole, usually because of murder, how to become powerful peacemakers to stop prison violence, and at the Congressional Budget Office, where I've trained senior analysts how to de-escalate members of Congress and staff. And this skill is the basis of my fourth book, De-Escalate, How to Calm an Angry Person in 90 Seconds or Less. So I want to take a moment and describe the skill set to you in 3 simple steps, and then we'll share some stories, of which we have many, both Aleya and I, of how the skill works. So to learn how to do this requires 3 steps. And these are counterintuitive and a little bit counter-normative. In other words, they fly against what you think you know about listening. But trust me on this, there is hard science that supports why this works. And you don't have to take our word for it. You can go out and practice it on your own, and you'll see exactly what we're talking about. So step number 1 is learn how to ignore the words. So you've got an angry, upset person. You ignore everything they're saying. They could be cussing you out. They could be shouting at you, spitting in your face, verbally aggressive and abusive. You just ignore it. Just ignore what they're saying. You've heard it 1,000 times before. You absolutely have our permission to ignore everything they're saying. Make it white noise. And when you ignore their words, a couple of things happen. 1, you are much less likely to become triggered yourself. And 2, you free up bandwidth in your brain to do the next 2 steps. So go against all your childhood conditioning and ignore the words. Don't ignore the person, just ignore what they're saying. You don't need to hear that right now. Step number 2, read the emotions. It turns out that our brains are hardwired to read the emotions of other people. And there's a really interesting reason for this. It has to do with evolutionary biology. I won't go into all the details right now, but suffice it to say that before hominids developed the ability to have language, which developed about 230,000 years ago, they had to communicate. And since they couldn't communicate with words because they didn't have the physical apparatus to speak as humans do today, they did it through emotion. And so our brains evolved over millions of years to read the emotions of each other as a form of communication. And we still have this innate skill in us. It's just that our society and our culture does not give any value to emotions. In fact, emotions are put down as being weak or irrational. And so we really never develop the innate skill that we all have. You can activate the skill very simply. All you have to do is quiet your mind, just stop thinking, stop processing, and just sit in a moment of silence while this angry person is screaming at you. And in a moment, the emotions that this person is experiencing will come into your consciousness. It's just that easy. It happens effortlessly. You don't have to think about it. You don't have to overwork it. It just happens. And you'll see when you start practicing it yourself how easy it is. Then the third step is a little counterintuitive. And again, is going to go against what you think you know about listening. But this is the only thing that really works. And that is that as the emotions come into your thoughts, you're going to reflect them back verbally to this angry person using a you statement. You've probably been taught that old active listening stuff using I statements that doesn't work, never has worked, never will work. It's awkward, it's pretentious, it's manipulative, it's smarmy. We hate it when it's done on ourselves, and yet it's still taught to psychologists and therapists and mediators as the way to listen. Totally wrong. It doesn't work. If it did work, we wouldn't be talking about it, this stuff. What you want to do instead is use a you statement. So if Aleya were really angry, let's say, I would say, Aleya, you're really angry, you're really upset, you're pissed off. That's the first layer. Then I might say, oh, you feel ignored and not heard, you're unappreciated and unsupported. And you feel like you're just totally invisible.
And
that's the next layer.
And so then
you feel disrespected.
And so when you're doing that, you're saying you feel, then I'm bringing my awareness inside and I'm checking to see if what Doug is saying is true or not true. And if we have a certain level of awareness of our emotions, we'll then be able to connect with what's really going on. And then we might actually interrupt the person who's validating our emotions and correct them. That doesn't mean that the person that's validating the emotions is wrong. I'll say, I feel really disrespected. And
then I will say, oh, you feel really disrespected.
And then I'll go, yes. And I start to nod my head.
You can't assume that because somebody is experiencing an emotion, that they know what emotion it is that they're experiencing. Remember, when we get highly emotional, the emotional centers of the brain go into complete overdrive and overwhelm the rest of the brain because the strong emotions are making us pay attention to something that might be dangerous. And so we don't have conscious control at that moment. So we're not aware of what we're feeling. All we know is that we're just really upset, but we really don't know what emotions we're feeling. When I tell Aleya what she's feeling, it gives her prefrontal cortex something to grab onto. It's like throwing a life ring into an ocean to somebody who's drowning, and they grab it and they hold on to it, and now they can start to process the information. So to continue, the first layer was the anger emotions. The second layer was being disrespected and ignored. The next thing I might say is, and you're really anxious and worried and concerned, and afraid. So those are the fear emotions. Then I'm going to go to the fourth layer, and you feel a little embarrassed and shamed by all of this. So that's guilt, shame, embarrassment, and those kinds of emotions. Then I'm going to go to the sadness emotions, and you're sad, and you're depressed, and you're upset, and you're distressed, and you're grieving. That's the fifth layer. And then the sixth layer would be something like this. And you feel completely abandoned and betrayed and all alone, and you feel unlovable and not loved? And then, as Aleya's nodding her head, she will say, yes, exactly. And then you're done.
And then all you have tears, but
and there'll be tears. Almost
if it's a safe enough container, then the person that you're validating, again, this can take time to build this skill set, but then you'll get the tears. And a lot of the times people are really uncomfortable when another person is processing emotions. And so if you start to get tears because you just validated somebody, silently say to yourself, you just did good. Keep holding the container and hold a safe space for them to use those waves of emotion to go through a moment of maturation, which actually helps them change their vibration, changes their chemistry, changes their consciousness, moves them into a more awakened state with their experience. So again, sometimes when somebody starts to cry, we want to soothe them and stop the crying. No, do the opposite. Continue holding a container and be in a silent container once you've gotten that deep core piece and the emotions start to move. And you can just nod your head and just silently say, you're safe. You're safe to feel these emotions. You're safe. It's okay. But don't say that out loud. Just say it silently to your own self to soothe your own self while you're in the presence of their emotional experience.
In the beginning, as you begin this practice of validating other people's emotions, you will have anxiety around your own self. Am I doing this right? Is this working? You'll also have anxiety around their emotions because their emotions will trigger anxiety within you. Learn to recognize your anxiety. As you become skilled in validating emotions, that anxiety that you have will go away because you'll begin to see the same patterns over and over and over again. What looks like chaos to most people when there are fights or arguments or strong emotions is orderly and predictable when you've mastered these skills, because you'll see that human beings have a very limited repertoire of emotions and behaviors when they're upset. And you'll be able to look at somebody who's angry or upset and say, oh, I know what's going on. This person is emotional. I know exactly what to say, how to say it, when to say it, and do it in a way that's graceful and compassionate to calm people down. And once you get skilled at this, you'll never have another fight or argument again in your life with anybody because you'll know exactly what to do. So let me share a couple of stories out of the Prison Project. I am the co-founder with my dear friend and colleague Laurel Copper of the Prison of Peace Project. And since 2010, we have been training incarcerated people in maximum security prisons, how to become peacemakers and mediators to stop prison violence. I want to share two stories about affect labeling in the prison environment that will bring home the power of what this is all about. The first story involved a woman by the name of Sarah, who was one of our first 15 women we trained on our very first cohort of Prison of Peace in what was at that time the largest, most violent women's prison in the world, Valley State Prison for Women in Chowchilla, California. That prison no longer, it's now a men's prison. It was repurposed in 2013. But we started with 15 women who were all serving long-term or life sentences, ages basically from 30 to 65, all different ethnicities and incredibly diverse group of women. In about the 5th week of training, when we were training these women to be peacemakers and mediators, we walked into the dingy conference room where we were doing our trainings. And one of our students, Sarah, was sitting in the corner, quietly sobbing. And we were there early, and she was there early, and she was obviously very upset. So we walked over, and Laurel kneeled down next to her and said, Sarah, what's going on? And Sarah told us this story. She told us, I am serving a 25 to life sentence because 18 years ago, as an alcoholic and a drunk driver, I killed a family of 4 in an automobile accident. And I came out of the accident completely unscathed, not a scratch on me. When I was sentenced to prison, I had to turn over my 3-year-old boy to my sister to raise. And I've written to him every single week for the last 18 years. He's never called me. He's never written back. He's never communicated with me. He's never come to visit me. The only way I know how he's doing is with my weekly calls with my sister, where she has told me what's going on in his life and what's happening. A couple of days ago, I decided to write a different kind of letter. I thought about what he must be experiencing emotionally for a mother who abandoned him, was so selfish that she was an addict and an alcoholic, and killed a family of 4 and is now serving a long prison sentence. What must it be like to be a young man growing up with a mother like that? And I wrote him a long letter reflecting all of the emotions that he must have experienced from the time he was 3 years old to now when he's 21 years old. And I mailed the letter off, just writing the way that you've been teaching us how to listen to emotions. Today, for the first time in 18 years, I received a letter back from him. Now, he was very angry in the letter, and he has every right to be angry. But at the end of the letter, he said, "Mom, I love you. I'm bringing my girlfriend, and we're going to come visit you in 3 weeks." And she started crying again. And at that moment, my jaw dropped as I listened to this and thought, wow, what we have here is extraordinarily powerful. And that's the first time I realized how powerful our training was in the prisons and how powerful the trainings were going to be outside the prisons. The second story also was a prison story. I've got a lot of prison stories. The second story is also a prison story, completely different. In this particular situation, the women's prison had repurposed to a men's prison. And I think this was probably in 2015. And a lot of our students started groups in self-help groups within the prison because they were taking the skills and passing them on and teaching them to other inmates, incarcerated people. And one of the programs that got started was a program where the probation officers in the various counties around the prison would bring teenagers in who were really close to going over the line. And they spent a day in prison to learn what it was like to be in prison. And in the morning, they were treated as inmates. And in the afternoon, they were mentored by inmates themselves. And so I was asked to come in and teach this group of about 100 men how to listen to a teenage boy using affect labeling. And I wanted to demonstrate the power of this. So I looked around the room at the beginning and I said, I'm going to show you how powerful this is. And I looked around the room. I looked for the biggest, meanest, most tatted up guy I could possibly find in the room. I mean, this guy, I wanted an animal. And so I said, who wants to volunteer to come up? And I point over to this monster of a guy. I'm big. I'm 6 foot, 215 pounds. And this guy towers over me. And he's tatted up and, obviously gangbanger. And so he gets up. And I said, "Are you prepared to cry?" in front of the group. And he looked at me and said, "What the fuck?" Like that. And I said, "Are you prepared to cry today?" And the rest of the guys just started cracking up. And the prison of peace guy said, "He's not kidding." And he said, So I said, "All right, well, so tell me what's going on in your life." So he just started with a few words. And then I started affect labeling. I could just pick up on. So I said, "So you're stuck here in prison. You're alone and lonely. You're really angry at yourself and frustrated. You feel like you're completely ignored by your family. No one ever talks to you. No one ever calls you. You're deeply, deeply embarrassed and shamed by the crimes that you committed. You feel completely isolated, alone. You're depressed and sad and grieving and feel like you have no connection with anybody from your life, including your family and your loved ones. They've all abandoned you. And you feel completely unloved and unlovable, completely rejected, and left completely alone from the people that you love because you're stuck here in prison." That's what I said. And sure enough, within about 3 seconds, you could just see the tears streaming down his face.
And he'd never been heard and listened to at a deep emotional level.
He turned to me and said, "That's the first time anybody has ever listened to me before in my life like that," and tears streaming down his face. So I sat there. You can't touch anybody in prison. So I just sat there and held presence for him to process it. And he said, and the room was so quiet, you could hear a pin drop. It's a room of 100 men in prison, dead silent. And finally, he got himself together and quietly sat down. And I said, "This is what you want to have happen. when you start listening to those teenagers. It's not about you. It's about listening them into existence. How many of you want to learn how to do this? Raise their hands, and then we're off to the races. That's how powerful this stuff is. So the first principle of learning how to be in the place where I'll bring you soup is learning how to validate emotions. Aleya, anything else you want to add before we end this session?
This sounds powerful, lovely, totally counterintuitive, and terrifying. And it's against the norm. We have been taught to be strong, stiff upper lip, push it down, get through it. We're invalidating our own selves all the time. So we're not naturally going to invalidate others. And so it does take a tremendous amount of courage, as well as a willingness to change, to learn, to cultivate a greater sense of self-love, self-worth, so that you have the ability to validate your own emotions and validate the emotions of another. But if you are willing to have the courage to change, to go against the grain, and to be a vibrational, emotional thought leader in the world that creates incredible change at a grassroots level, then this is a primary skill set. And then coupled with meeting your needs, cultivating more self-love, self-worth, looking for the needs internally, your life within a very short period of time will be beyond fulfilling. It will be a life of healthy service where you are so full inside yourself and the passion and the joy for life explode. So if you are feeling like you have no purpose in your life, no one values you, you don't feel like you're here in this world for anything, and this skill set or these skill sets we're talking about create a little tug at your heart. Play with the idea that somewhere deep in your core, you have the capacity. And these are very simple tools, but you do have to have a certain level of courage to pick them up. And we are here to support you in that process.